The desert that morning looked less like a battlefield and more like a graveyard of pride. The sun hung low, casting a molten haze over the dunes of Tunisia, where the last columns of the Africa Corps stood still, silent, defeated, and shimmering in the heat. Dust clung to their uniforms, the once iron-gray fabric now faded to the color of sand. They had fought across half a continent, through Egypt and Libya, from El Alamein to Tunis, but now there was nowhere left to march. The Allied cordon had closed in like an iron lid. In May 1943, after 2 years of brutal desert warfare, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered, nearly 250,000 men. It was one of the largest mass capitulations in modern history. The German officers, trained to die rather than yield, now stood in disbelief, helmets under their arms, their faces hollowed by exhaustion and dust. Among them was Field Marshal Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, successor to Rommel, a man once celebrated in Berlin's newspapers as the Lion of Tunisia. But there were no roars left, only the quiet clink of metals against buttons as he turned himself over to the British First Army. The Field Marshal's eyes were hidden behind steel-rimmed glasses, but his voice was steady when he asked for the surrender papers. "It is better to lose honor than men," he muttered, though the words caught like sand in his throat. Around him, his staff officers avoided eye contact, unsure whether they were witnessing cowardice or courage. The desert wind picked up, scattering papers, tin cups, and fragments of a broken radio. Somewhere in the distance, an American tank revved its engine, Sherman, model M4A1, its turret glinting like a mirror under the punishing sun. For the Allies, it was a victory long overdue. The North African campaign had cost the British and Americans over 70,000 casualties. For the Germans, it was humiliation. Berlin's propaganda had promised triumph and glory, the march to the Suez, the fall of Cairo. Yet now the men who had once sung marching songs in the dunes were being marched themselves into captivity. But even in surrender there was discipline. Columns of German prisoners moved in perfect order, rifles stacked neatly beside them, boots clicking in the dust as if still on parade. Many expected punishment or public mockery. Nazi broadcasts had painted the Americans as crude barbarians, brutal, mechanical, without honor. "They'll starve you, make you work like cattle," one officer had warned his men weeks before capture. But what they saw when they reached the Allied lines surprised them. American medics tending to German wounded with the same care as their own. Water flasks passed hand to hand under the same blistering sun. One private, barely 19, whispered to his friend, "If this is defeat, it tastes different than we were told." The prisoners were gathered at makeshift processing camps near Bizerte and Algiers. From there, the Americans began the monumental task of relocating tens of thousands of Axis soldiers across the Atlantic. It was a logistical miracle, an operation of quiet magnitude. U.S. Army Transport Command requisitioned troop ships and converted Liberty vessels, each capable of carrying several thousand men. To avoid submarine attack, convoys zigzagged their way westward, escorted by destroyers. The captured soldiers who had once feared Allied bombs now trusted them to protect the very ships they traveled in. Von Arnim was placed aboard one such vessel, the USS Monterey, along with several generals and staff officers. The crossing took nearly 2 weeks. For men accustomed to giving orders, there was now nothing to do but stare at the horizon. Conversations were hushed, dignity maintained by routine, uniforms pressed, boots polished, salutes exchanged. Yet beneath the discipline lingered unease. Where were they going? What would become of them? Would the Americans parade them through the streets as trophies of conquest? The ship's canteen served them twice a day, beans, bread, occasionally a slice of apple pie. It was simple food, but far better than the salted rations of the desert. Some refused at first out of pride. Others ate in silence, ashamed of their hunger. On the third day, an American sergeant passed by their table and with a grin dropped off a bottle of ketchup. "Figured you fellas might want flavor," he said. The Germans exchanged confused glances, half expecting mockery. None came. At night, the Atlantic heaved like a living thing, waves striking the hull with dull, rhythmic thuds. Von Arnim stood on deck, coat buttoned tight against the wind. The stars stretched endlessly above, free, indifferent. Behind him, one of his adjutants, a young major, asked quietly, "Herr Feldmarschall, do you think they will treat us as prisoners or as men?" Arnhem didn't answer at first. His breath formed ghosts in the cold air. Finally he said, "We will see what kind of men they are." When the convoy reached the U.S. East Coast, the prisoners were disembarked under heavy security but no hostility. No jeers, no press photographers, no propaganda parade. Instead there were buses, civilian style, not trucks, waiting to transport them inland. Guards wore clean uniforms and spoke without malice. One even helped an elderly German colonel carry his bag down the gangplank. The field marshal noticed the gesture and said softly, "Not barbarians, then." They were told their destination was a holding facility in the American South. None of them had seen the Deep South before, except perhaps in postcards or films. The word Mississippi stirred curiosity. To many Germans it sounded almost mythical. Swamps, cotton fields, the sound of jazz. As their train cut through rolling green hills, the prisoners peered through barred windows expecting hostility from locals. Instead they saw children waving from porches and farmers tipping their hats as the carriages passed. The irony was inescapable. Men who had invaded continents were now being welcomed into a nation they had once mocked as materialistic and soft. The train rattled on through forests and farmland until at last it slowed near Clinton, Mississippi, a quiet town of wooden houses and red clay roads. Beyond a cluster of pines stood their new world, Camp Clinton, one of America's highest security POW centers, built to house officers and generals. As the Germans disembarked, they were greeted not by snarling guards but by the smell of bread baking somewhere nearby. The air was humid, heavy with the scent of pine and soil after rain. One sergeant handed out slips of paper printed with the camp's rules in both English and German. At the bottom it read, "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Your conduct will determine your privileges." For a long moment no one spoke. Then a captain laughed bitterly under his breath. "Privileges," he said. "We are guests now, are we?" Von Arnim didn't respond. His gaze wandered toward the distant mess hall where smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere inside, unseen hands were cooking. The field marshal adjusted his hat, his voice quiet but firm. "If they mean to win the war this way," he said, "they may already have." And as the camp gate swung open with a low creak, the German officers stepped through, not into captivity, but into a strange kind of civility that none of them had been prepared to face. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the Mississippi soil. For the first time in years, the smell of dinner, not gunpowder, filled the air. The war, it seemed, had changed shape. Dawn came softly over the pines of Mississippi. Mist rose from the wet grass, curling around the barbed wire fences that enclosed Camp Clinton. Birds sang from somewhere beyond the watchtowers, their calls unbothered by the war that had brought these strangers here. Inside the camp, men in gray uniforms stirred from their bunks, folding blankets with military precision. The German officers woke not to gunfire or shouting, but to the ringing of a morning bell and the smell of coffee. It was disorienting, almost obscene, that captivity could begin with comfort. Field Marshal Hans-Jürgen von Arnim sat at the edge of his cot, his back straight, his face unreadable. Around him, his staff officers moved quietly as though any sound might shatter the strange peace they'd found themselves in. The wooden barracks were warm, the floors swept, the air faintly scented with soap. On a small table stood a pitcher of water and a loaf of bread. It was not much, but after the desert, after months of dust and hunger, it felt like luxury. "They want us alive," one officer murmured. Von Arnim didn't answer. He was still listening, to the laughter of an American guard outside. It was the laughter, not the fences, that unsettled him most. Outside, Camp Clinton looked almost pastoral. Rows of barracks stood between pines and open fields. There was a baseball diamond at one end, a small library, even a chapel. The fences gleamed in the sunlight, but they were more symbolic than threatening. Few prisoners tried to escape. Most knew there was nowhere to go. The war was an ocean away, and the locals, polite but watchful, had grown used to the sight of the Germans marching in neat rows for morning roll call. They were taller than expected, many blonde, many quiet, and they saluted the American officers with the same crispness they once reserved for Berlin. The U.S. Army ran its POW camps under the Geneva Convention to the letter. Each prisoner received the same rations as an American soldier, roughly 3,000 calories a day. It was equality by rule, not by sentiment, but the effect was startling. The German officers had arrived gaunt and hollow-cheeked, Within weeks, they began to regain color, even laughter. Camp reports would later note that many POWs actually gained weight during captivity, a statistic that infuriated some American civilians but quietly impressed others. The Americans who guarded them were mostly young men, barely trained, often students or farm boys waiting to be reassigned. They called the Germans Krauts with teasing familiarity, not hatred. Some guards even found themselves liking the prisoners. After all, they played chess, read Goethe, and built furniture out of scrap wood. One guard, Private William Davis, wrote in his journal, "They salute better than we do. Some of them thank you when you hand them food. Strange thing, respect. Hard to hate a man who looks you in the eye and says thank you." In the mess hall, the first meal was served at 7 sharp. Long tables, clean trays, stainless cutlery. The clatter of metal and murmur of foreign voices filled the air. When the German officers entered, conversation hushed for a moment. An American cook, apron dusted with flour, waved them forward. "Step right up, gents," he said, as if addressing guests at a diner. On the menu that morning, scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee. A few of the Germans hesitated, waiting for orders that never came. Then von Arnim stepped forward, accepted his tray, and nodded politely to the cook. It was a small gesture, but it broke the spell. Soon the line moved, and the hall filled with cautious clinking of forks. The taste was unremarkable, simple, honest food. But to men who had survived on half rations and desert dust, it was almost transcendent. One colonel closed his eyes at the first sip of coffee, letting the warmth spread through him like mercy. Across the table, another officer laughed quietly, shaking his head. "The Führer should have sent us here months ago," he said in German. The remark drew nervous chuckles. Even humor felt dangerous now. Von Arnim said nothing, though a flicker of amusement touched his lips. Life in captivity developed its rhythm. Mornings for exercise, afternoons for labor or study. The Germans built greenhouses, painted landscapes, even taught language classes. Some were assigned to nearby farms, harvesting cotton and potatoes under supervision. They worked efficiently, sometimes singing folk songs as they moved. Local farmers, at first suspicious, began to bring them water and biscuits. One Mississippi woman told a newspaper, "They're just boys, polite as church ushers. I reckon they'd fix my roof if I asked." Yet beneath the civility lingered unease. News of the war filtered slowly through the camp, snippets of radio broadcasts. American newspapers passed hand to hand. Reports of Allied bombings in Hamburg and Cologne stirred tension. At night, the officers gathered in the barracks to discuss rumors. Was Germany losing? Was the Reich collapsing? No one dared say it outright, but the silence between sentences grew heavier with each passing week. Von Arnim kept his composure, though inside he felt the slow disintegration of everything he'd built his life upon. He had served an empire that promised order and greatness. Now he stood in a camp where his captors treated him better than his own regime had treated its soldiers. One afternoon, while walking near the fence, von Arnim stopped to watch an American guard toss a baseball to another. The motion was loose, easy, joyful. It was the same energy that had animated the Allies in Tunisia, their strange ability to fight fiercely yet live lightly. A young lieutenant beside him spoke softly. "They win because they play," he said. Von Arnim didn't reply, but he knew the man was right. Letters from home were slow to arrive, censored and delayed. When they came, they were read in silence. Some spoke of bombed cities, others of families displaced or gone. For the first time, the prisoners realized that the world they'd fought for might no longer exist. The arrogance that had once held their chins high began to fade, replaced by something quieter, reflection, even shame. Still, they found dignity in small acts, keeping their uniforms pressed, sharing tobacco, translating English words into German notebooks. By autumn, the rhythms of captivity felt almost ordinary. The camp had become a small, surreal society, half military, half farmstead. There were chess tournaments, art contests, even a Christmas choir. On Sundays, the Americans allowed the Germans to attend service in the chapel. Hymns sung in 2 languages rose together into the pine-scented air, harmonizing in ways politics never could. But the real transformation was slower, subtler. The men who had once marched across Africa in perfect formation now lined up for supper with schoolboy patience. There were no speeches, no flags, no anthems, just the sound of trays sliding across a counter and a voice calling, "Next!" One evening, as von Arnim took his place in line, An American guard nodded toward the kitchen. "Tomorrow," the guard said with a grin, "we're serving roast beef. Southern style." The field marshal arched a brow. "Roast beef?" he repeated as if testing the words for sincerity. "Yes, sir," the guard said. "Real good stuff." Von Arnim stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Behind him the officers followed, some smiling faintly, others whispering about the strange decency of their captors. Outside, the sun sank over the Mississippi hills, painting the camp in gold. The air carried the faint, unmistakable scent of meat roasting somewhere nearby. For a brief, disorienting moment, it smelled like home. And as the evening bugle sounded, marking another day of captivity without cruelty, a quiet thought began to settle among the prisoners. Perhaps defeat did not always come in chains. Sometimes it came with the aroma of dinner. The night smelled of rain and roasting meat. Inside the mess hall of Camp Clinton, the air shimmered with heat rising from long steel trays, the sound of ladles striking pots, and the low murmur of 100 conversations carried in 2 languages. The German officers filed in as they did every evening, quiet, composed, their boots polished, their discipline intact even in captivity. Yet tonight something was different. The aroma drifting through the room was rich and unfamiliar. Slow-cooked beef glazed in brown gravy, mashed potatoes with butter pooling at their edges, warm cornbread golden under lamplight. The Americans had decided to serve a full Southern dinner. Field Marshal Hans-Jürgen von Arnim stood near the front of the line, hands clasped behind his back. He had eaten in marble halls before, banquets in Berlin, receptions in Rome, but he had never stood in line for food. The American cook behind the counter, a broad man with tired eyes and a streak of flour on his apron, greeted him with a nod. "Evening, sir," he said, casual but not mocking. He slid a tray across, loaded it high with roast beef, green beans, and a slice of apple pie. "Hope you're hungry." Von Arnim paused, almost unsure what to say. He nodded stiffly. "Danke," the cook smiled. "You're welcome, General." It was the first time any American had called him that. He carried his tray to a table near the window and sat among his staff officers. For a moment, none of them touched their food. The silence was almost reverent. Steam curled upward, mingling with the faint scent of coffee and rain seeping in through the open shutters. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the Mississippi hills. One colonel, his hair still trimmed with military precision, finally broke the spell. "Roast beef," he said in German, almost laughing. I had forgotten what it smelled like. Another officer took a bite, then set his fork down slowly, his expression unreadable. "It tastes better than Banquets," he murmured. The words hung in the air. Someone chuckled, but no one disagreed. They all ate then, silently, methodically, as if the act itself carried weight. Von Arnim chewed slowly, his mind flickering between disbelief and reflection. The texture of the meat, the warmth of the bread, the sweetness of the pie, these were things he had known before the war, before the desert, before the Reich turned ambition into hunger. Now, in the heart of enemy territory, they had returned to him, stripped of arrogance and ceremony. The American guards watched from a distance, leaning on the doorframe. They saw no hostility in their prisoners, only men savoring a meal like survivors of a shipwreck. Private William Davis whispered to his friend, "You'd think we were feeding them kings." His friend shrugged. "Maybe that's the trick," he said. "Feed a man better than he fed himself, he starts wondering who the real civilized ones are." Across the room, an older German major, once an aristocrat from Hanover, wiped his mouth with a napkin and looked toward von Arnim. "Do you think this is kindness or strategy?" he asked softly. The field marshal didn't look up. "Both," he said, "and perhaps that is what makes it effective." After dinner, the officers lingered in the mess hall, reluctant to leave. Rain pattered softly against the windows. Someone played a harmonica, a slow, melancholy tune that sounded half like a lullaby, half like surrender. An American sergeant entered quietly and collected trays, nodding respectfully to the officers as he passed. When he reached von Arnim's table, the field marshal looked up and asked, "Tell me, Sergeant, do you treat all prisoners this way?" The man smiled faintly. "Only the ones who behave," he said. Then, after a pause, "You folks sure seem to appreciate a good meal." Von Arnim studied the man's face. There was no malice there, no mockery, only a weary decency that he could neither despise nor ignore. "Yes," he said finally. "We had forgotten what that was like." In the days that followed, the phrase spread through the camp, "It tastes better than banquets." It was repeated half in jest, half in awe, whispered between barracks, scribbled in letters home that would never reach Germany. The irony was impossible to miss. The generals of the Third Reich who once dined under chandeliers now praising the cooking of their enemies. But beneath the humor lay something deeper, a recognition that civilization was not measured in medals or salutes, but in how one treated those they could crush. American officers took note. Reports sent to Washington described the remarkable discipline and cooperation of the German POWs. Morale is high, one wrote, largely due to humane conditions and decent food. What the bureaucrats didn't record was the psychological shift happening inside those fences. Pride was dissolving, replaced by an uneasy respect. The war had taught them to hate the enemy. Captivity was teaching them to understand him. Some evenings, American and German officers sat near the fence, smoking in companionable silence. They spoke little of politics. Instead, they compared weather, childhood memories, even recipes. One night, an American captain asked von Arnim what his favorite dish had been in Germany. "Venison stew," he replied. The captain laughed. "We've got deer here, too. Maybe we'll make some one day." Von Arnim almost smiled. "If we are still here when the season comes," he said, "perhaps I will help." But not everyone accepted this new civility. Among the younger officers, especially those still loyal to Hitler, whispers of shame and resentment grew. "They fatten us like livestock," one lieutenant said bitterly. "They want to break us with kindness," another agreed. "They want us to admire them, to forget who we are." Von Arnim overheard such talk one night and silenced them with a glance. "If kindness breaks you," he said coldly, "perhaps you are already broken." He returned to his cot that night restless, his mind turning. What did it mean to lose a war and yet be treated with dignity? Was this mercy or mockery, or was it a lesson? He thought of the countless men he had commanded, of the arrogance that had carried them into deserts and death. Perhaps the Americans understood something the Reich never did, that power did not need cruelty to assert itself. Days turned to weeks. The German officers began volunteering for more work around the camp, repairing fences, tending gardens, painting murals. One morning, an American reporter visited and photographed them smiling as they built picnic tables. The image would later appear in newspapers with the caption, "Nazis enjoying captivity in America." Washington officials were uneasy about the optics, but the army stood firm. "We're feeding decency," one colonel said. "That's a weapon, too." On the last evening of summer, the officers were served another feast: fried chicken, vegetables, coffee, and pie. The atmosphere was almost festive. The cook joked with the prisoners as if they were neighbors, not enemies. When von Arnim rose to leave, he turned back to the kitchen and said in careful English, "Tell your men, it is better than banquets." The cook grinned. "I'll take that as a compliment, sir." Outside, the air was cool and sweet. The men walked back to their barracks under a pale moon, their shadows stretching long across the gravel. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle called through the night, the reminder that the war still raged across the ocean. Von Arnim paused and looked toward the sound, his face unreadable. "Someday," he said quietly, "they will feed us home, too." And as the whistle faded into the Mississippi dark, he realized the most dangerous weapon he had encountered in this war was not a bomb or a bullet. It was generosity. By 1945, the war that had swallowed continents was dying, but its echo still reached across the oceans, to the quiet, pine-scented world of Camp Clinton. Spring had come early that year. The fields around the compound shimmered green again, and the air no longer carried the metallic tang of fear. For most of the German prisoners, time had begun to move differently, no longer measured by battles or orders, but by meals, letters, and the slow rhythm of work. They were soldiers without a war, and in their stillness something began to shift inside them. Field Marshal von Arnim had changed in ways his younger self might have found unthinkable. The stiffness of his uniform remained, but there was softness now in his expression, an acceptance that could only be learned through loss. Each morning he walked the perimeter of the camp with a notebook tucked under his arm. He recorded the weather, the names of birds, the strange accents of the American guards. Once, when an old sergeant offered him a cup of coffee, he took it without hesitation. "It is better," he said with a faint smile, than the rations we gave our own men. The Americans noticed too. Camp Clinton had become less a prison and more a mirror, a place where both captors and captives confronted the small absurdities of war. The guards had come to admire the Germans' discipline. The Germans had come to envy the Americans' ease. It was not friendship, not quite, but it was something dangerously close. On weekends they played baseball together, and though the Germans never quite understood the rules, their precision made them formidable pitchers. When one of them hit a ball clean over the fence, the Americans cheered without irony. The fence, after all, was no longer a wall. It was a boundary of understanding. The news from Europe trickled in through newspapers and radio. Rumors of Hitler's bunker, of collapsing cities, of Berlin in ruins. The prisoners listened in silence. One by one, their illusions crumbled. The men who had once sworn oaths to the Führer now stared at the dirt floor, ashamed of what had been done in their name. Some wept quietly at night. Others sought the chapel, where an American chaplain offered words that needed no translation. Even von Arnim, who had never been seen to pray, sat in the back pew one evening, his cap in his hands, his gaze fixed on the wooden cross. It was then that the true victory began, not the one measured in land or flags, but in the slow restoration of conscience. The Americans, guided by the Geneva Convention and something deeper than law, treated their prisoners with an almost defiant humanity. They paid them a small wage for labor, taught them English, and allowed lectures on democracy. The officers scoffed at first, dismissing it as propaganda, but soon curiosity replaced cynicism. They asked questions. They debated politics with their guards. They spoke of the future, not of conquest, but of rebuilding. Von Arnim himself led these discussions. He gathered the younger officers in the shade of the mess hall, speaking not as a commander, but as a man who had seen the cost of obedience. The Americans fight differently, he told them. They believe in what they are fighting for, and they feed even their enemies. That is a strength, not a weakness. His words carried more weight than any lecture. Men who once worshipped hierarchy now began to study democracy. They wrote essays, held debates, even drafted visions of a Germany reborn from the ashes. The camp's library became their new front line. Books replaced rifles. Hemingway and Steinbeck passed between hands once stained by gun oil. In one report to Washington, a visiting inspector wrote, "It is not through punishment that we change these men, but through the quiet insistence of fairness." He was right. The re-education of the German mind did not happen through speeches. It happened through the taste of cornbread, the warmth of a handshake, the realization that freedom was not cruelty disguised. Still, not all hearts softened. A small faction of diehards clung to their old faith, sneering at their comrades' gratitude. They called them traitors of pride. One evening, an argument erupted between two officers. "You sit here eating American food and calling it justice," shouted the younger man. "You disgrace our flag." Von Arnim rose from his chair, his voice low but sharp. "The flag you speak of was carried by children into graves," he said. "If decency shames you, then shame may be your first step toward redemption." The room fell silent. The younger man left without another word. As the war in Europe ended, the camp began to change. The guards received new orders: prepare for repatriation. The prisoners packed their few belongings: letters, sketches, and hand-carved souvenirs. Some wept. Others stared at the horizon in quiet disbelief. They were going home to a nation unrecognizable, stripped of everything except memory. Yet somewhere beneath their grief there was gratitude. One officer said softly, "They defeated us without hatred. Perhaps that is why they will never truly lose." On the last evening before departure, the Americans hosted a small farewell supper. Long tables were set in the open air beneath the pine trees. The same cook who had once served roast beef now carried trays of stew and bread. The German officers stood when the American commander entered. He raised a glass of iced tea. "Gentlemen," he said, "this war took too many good men from both sides. I hope when you return you'll remember how we treated you, not as enemies but as men." The applause that followed was soft, hesitant, but sincere. For a brief moment, the war felt impossibly distant. Later that night, von Arnim sat outside his barracks, smoking a final cigarette. Fireflies drifted through the warm air, their light blinking like forgotten stars. He thought of the deserts of Africa, The roar of tanks, the endless maps marked with red arrows. All of it seemed meaningless now. What endured was not conquest but compassion, the memory of a nation that had fought him with dignity, and in doing so, disarmed his hatred more completely than any victory parade. When dawn broke, the prisoners marched to the trucks waiting beyond the gate. The Americans saluted them as they passed. Some of the Germans returned the gesture. Von Arnim was last to leave. He paused at the gate, turning to look once more at the camp that had held him captive, and had freed something inside him he hadn't known was chained. Years later, in an interview, he would be asked what he remembered most of his captivity. He didn't mention the fences or the guards. He simply said they gave us food, and they gave us back our humanity. And so in the quiet fields of Mississippi, far from the bombed cities and speeches of Europe, America had won a different kind of war. A victory written not in blood, but in bread. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, like this video, share it, and subscribe for more forgotten moments where decency, not destruction, changed history.